Hello, my name is Sasha Farbach, and I'm now speaking to Professor Kataryna Wolczuk from the University of Birmingham about all things how to deter Russia in our modern age. Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, we're looking at this whole conflict with Russia, and it's a challenge of how democracies can be resilient. What's missing? How can our democracies really weather this change? What's needed?
We are talking about the West, and the West is a group of democracies. And they have very different sort of experiences, historical experiences. And some of us, including Poland or countries like Estonia, Lithuania, have a much greater sort of what we call lived experience of interacting with Russia. So now we are dealing for the second year with a massive sort of scale invasion, the biggest war in Europe since the Second World War. And from that point of view, we've had steep learning curve in terms of what we are dealing with, but also countries project their own understanding and their own ideas what Russia is trying to achieve based on their own history. Mm-hmm. And from that point of view, we have the West, but also have a considerable degree of plurality and diversity within the West. And it's always a task of keeping us together on the same page when it comes to Russia.
But if we look around now, are we on the same page? You said lived experience, but if we look at Europe, as you said, the Baltic states, Poland, very different from, if we look further west, Germany, France, Italy, Spain. Do we need that lived experience to understand Russia?
Yes and no, because many people in Poland, they don't need to learn, they just have look at history. For example, my first political memory as a child in Poland in the early 1970s was talking to a widow of a Polish officer who was murdered at Katyn by the Red Army, by the Soviet Army. So from that point of view, my childhood memories are about dealing with oppression and with suffering, and a poor woman who never remarried, never had grandchildren, and I was her substitute grandchild. And she used to walk me to a kindergarten. And when you think that, 50 years later, you have the same happening in Europe again, this is for many people from Central Eastern Europe reliving the trauma of the past, something which we thought we left behind. And unfortunately, what we see that, in a way, the Russia strategy hasn't changed in terms of deportation, in terms of brutality, and of practices of ethnic cleansing. And from that point of view, Russia actually made it easier for the West to unite, because we haven't seen such a war of aggression and the level of everyday brutality which we see on the front line and behind in the occupied territory, which actually, despite our very different lived experiences, for the West to come together and stay united.
Mm-hmm. But if we look at also the West, we also look at the global South, also democracies there that seem to be on a very different page when it comes to working with Russia, or still not really working against them at all, namely some of the largest democracies, Brazil, looking at India. If you assess that, how are we able to, because it's very economic, Russia's influence is a very economic one in those countries. Are we progressing? Are these countries coming closer to this idea of knowing that Russia is an imperialist force, or how do you assess that in terms of the global southern democracies?
Yes, in the South we have both sort of democracies like South Africa, also Brazil, and the global South, or India, but we have also many autocracies. What is interesting, this skepticism from the global South vis-à-vis the West. So perhaps that's one of the most interesting lessons we've had over the last 2.5 years, that on the one hand we could say that Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not rocket science. It's a country which attacked its neighbor, not only its neighbor, but it's committed war crimes, and it's denying the right to exist, and say that Ukraine's existence is basically the very existence, the Ukrainian language and culture present a direct threat to Russia. So this is as basically colonialist as you can be, and yet many countries which have developed this identity as being basically victims of of Western colonialism, have actually are basically standing on a sideway and not wanting to recognize Russia for its neo-imperial war. And there is actually sometimes not that much difference. And the realization in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, but also sort of in the West, that condemning colonialism very often means only condemning Western colonialism and not siding with other colonizing power. Mm-hmm. Because Russia the Soviet Union was very effective during the Cold War to nurture, to maintain, promote ties in what we call now the global South countries. And those ties, this influence, now pays off in a massive way.
And it's also these changes cannot be reverted or changed quickly. I know we're going now into almost our third year of this war in Ukraine, but there's been incredible international effort. But at the same time, when you mention colonialism, of course, countries like France, the UK, those things are directed at them, and it's harder for the global South to listen to those countries. But perhaps it's not the same case with Poland. Does Poland have more of a, let's say, moral high ground in this regard? Can Poland play a bigger role in convincing the global South to stay true to the West?
This is a very important point because Poland certainly hasn't been, didn't have the sort of Western-style colonies. But I think we've taken a lot for granted in Poland that we thought that we actually moved to the West and we didn't need to bring our own experience. So over the last 30 years, we've achieved a lot, but the war, Russia's war against Ukraine also tells us that there's much more homework that we need to do. In Poland, we actually haven't thought at all about engaging with the global South and ensuring that our Cold War experience is actually appreciated. From the other side of the Iron Curtain, that actually our lives and our experience matters when it comes to understanding history in this part of Europe. Mm-hmm. And we've taken it for granted, joining the West, and in a way we've been resting on our laurels. Whereas now we know that much more engagement, much more suasion is needed. And that's one of the things for Polish diplomacy to engage in.
Also, if we look at just the whole region, diplomacy will change. Now I think it's a win for this region. We have Kaja Kallas of Estonia now as the new high rep in the European Union. They're in Brussels. That's also a win for this region. That's also lived experience. I mean, she's been very outspoken against Russia. Do you think that will now also translate into more of a bigger focus for the world to listen to this region?
This is a very interesting point, and no doubt there is a big achievement. And paradoxically, in the same way that the membership of NATO by Finland and Sweden would not have happened without Russia's war against Ukraine, and we also, the High Representative, the chief diplomat of the EU coming from Estonia, there is no doubt it's one of the unintended consequences of that war. And I think Estonia has lived in the shadow of its trauma, not only Poland, but especially sort of the three Baltic states. And now reliving this trauma and speaking from that lived experience provides with a powerful, compelling moral case for standing up to Russia's aggression. So from that point of view, the EU, which basically emerged or credited itself as a post-geopolitical entity where we overcame war and hostilities on the European continent. Now we are in the post-geopolitical stage, and we need to have and look at the world and Europe as it is, and not what we thought we were getting. Mm-hmm. And from that point of view, we can see that sort of, even when it comes to top positions in the EU, we can see that shift happening.
Interesting shift indeed, which we continue to cover. Thank you, Professor, so much for that and your time today.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for watching. That's Sasha Farbach for TVP World.